Okay, thanks for that. And here we go. I'm going to share my screen again.
Jesuit education should be transformative education. The main mission of any Jesuit education is to help students developing their potential in such a way so that everyone becomes a person of compassion, competence, and conscience. One very important area in our college is taking care of what we call the Ignatian value, personalis, care for the individual.
Care of that whole person so deeply that providing constructive feedback to help people grow becomes part of the vernacular, not just a pat on the back. I think, growing this capability or this capacity for Ignatian leadership transcends not just to faculty and staff, but also transcends to students.
Un liderazgo que no se impone, sino que propone, que no vence, sino que convence. Es un liderazgo que implica el inspirar a otros.
Invite those whom you lead or with whom you work to live into sort of the fullness of their giftedness.
El tipo de liderazgo que se requiere en general en las universidades me parece que es un liderazgo que busca en todo momento cuáles son las mejores condiciones para formar estudiantes que sean capaces de contemplar la realidad, de analizarla, de sentirla, para que con base en ello puedan ir apropiándose de acciones que los lleven a desarrollar mejores condiciones de vida para todos.
Se necesita un tipo de liderazgo abierto a los demás, que ponga al centro a las personas, tanto como sujetos individuales, pero sobre todo como sujetos colectivos, sujetos comunitarios.
Communal discernment has become a huge part of how I lead at Creighton, engaging my colleagues to think more deeply about the difference we want to make in students' lives.
Me imagino el futuro de la formación de líderes ignacianos, leyendo en todo momento los signos de los tiempos.
Para entender la situación de los jóvenes hoy, de ofrecerles experiencias que los contagien, en donde ellos vivan en carne propia lo que es la injusticia, pero también la capacidad de la gente para luchar por sí misma.
Por sus aspiraciones de vida, por la manera en que están construyendo procesos de justicia, procesos de igualdad.
C'est un leadership courageux qui résiste à toutes sortes de pressions, encore en train d'arriver à l'université. Ce que je veux dire par là, c'est que
aquello que te da paz, que te da tranquilidad, que aumenta tu fe, tu esperanza y tu amor a los demás, es un señal de que eso es lo que Dios te está pidiendo, aunque te cueste trabajo, aunque sea difícil.
La capacité à créer une communauté éducative, à être une communauté universitaire, une communauté de.
Entonces, el tipo de liderazgo que creo que se necesita es uno que contagie, que sea capaz de sumar a los chavos, de convocarlos, de escucharlos, pero sobre todo de motivarlos a que tengan sus propias opciones y que sean capaces de luchar por ellas.
Quant à l'aspect communautaire, social ou politique de l'éducation jésuite, son objectif est de former des hommes et des femmes capables, c'est-à-dire capables de transformer les différentes structures des sociétés humaines dans lesquelles ils travaillent.
De travailler à l'union des cœurs, à construire, à harmoniser, à travailler pour pacifier cette œuvre.
I think the formation of faculty into Ignatian leaders is a difficult task. I think we need to become more and more creative and innovative.
Estas líneas sobre las cuales se van definiendo los nuevos modos de hacer la educación sean modos que nos lleven a disminuir las desigualdades, a cuidar la casa común como el espacio en el que todos habitamos, para que en todo momento vayamos formando estudiantes capaces de transformar la realidad de la que van siendo parte.
As higher education changes so dramatically, we have more need for partnerships, working together with other institutions. We're not self-contained anymore. And I think that focus on the other puts Jesuit education and Jesuit educators in a strong position to lead and partner.
And to me, that's the power of being Jesuit educated and having colleagues who are a part of this extraordinary mission that's so much bigger than any one of us.
Well, I invite you just to close your eyes for a moment, maybe just 30 seconds, and just pay attention to what resonance remains with you from this video. We know these videos are fast-paced, so many voices, so many words, so many images. But I invite you just to close your eyes for a moment and to attend to what it is that remains with you from this experience. What is it that touches you? What is it that feels consistent with your values, with your commitments, with your own personal sense of vocation and call in the world? What is it that, for you, is most important about your own affiliation with this particular mission in Jesuit higher education? What is it that matters most to you today about what you do and how you do it? And in a few moments, we'll be inviting you just to open up your mics. And for those of you who feel moved, to share briefly what it is that resonates with you from your reflection.
I like very much the plurality of context that has been shown, the US, Latin America, Africa, India, that makes it very inclusive, and I feel really included and represented there.
Thanks, Gonzalo.
I think there is a common message in all of this, and it's a message, a propositive message, to feel reality and to act from that feeling, and the requirement of being creative.
Gracias, Marianne.
I only want to pick up one word. It's transformation. It reminded me to what an Indian colleague once said to me. He said, in universities, we give a lot of information, and now we more and more realize that formation is important, but what we forget is that the aim should be transformation. And what's puzzling me at the moment, that it seems not really work very well. So the development, sometimes within the church, but mostly in society, is going to another direction than I have in mind. At least I think many people have in mind.
Dankeschön.
I like this idea of contagion, and it connects with the creativity. I think so. It's being contagious rather than authoritative, in inspiring autonomy, I guess, in people, people that think for themselves and I mean, explore what it means to have a conscience and things like that.
Thanks, Tomas. So, an education which is contagious, and contagious for encouraging conscientiousness, which in our day is so countercultural. Education which is transformational, not only informational. Generative AI can provide so much, and it will change so much. It will change so much about us, but maybe not in the ways that we always desire. How do we foster an education that transforms in the direction of our deepest desires? This sense of being able to be creative at a time when creativity is more needed than ever, and not just individual creativity, but collective creativity. How do we together join in networks to collaborate in creative ways for the solutions we need for our times? It's really, even though it was filmed several years ago now, there's something perennial about Jesuit education which remains consistent for 500 years, because it is what is most deeply human. And as Gonzalo was noting, it has a kind of global relevance, even though we really respect individual contexts and cultures. There's something that speaks to the human. Nuria, thank you for your note. We look forward to when you can join us by camera. Okay. So what I'd like to do now is move into the survey data which you provided, because I think it raised some interesting questions, and then we'll continue on. My aim is to give us at least 15, 20 minutes for conversation. So let's see how this works. I often over-prepare, as I'm sure you are familiar yourselves. So here we go. Okay, so when we look to what you said, I think that one of the most powerful things about the instincts in Jesuit education is to start with the person in front of us, not only of the material that we want to impart to them. And when we start with, the other person as the prime material, what was immediately apparent is that you have a range of backgrounds and levels of familiarity with both Ignatian spirituality and what the mission is about. No doubt you have a broad span in terms of how long you've been involved in these various missions around Europe and the Middle East. One person said they brought curiosity about how Ignatian spirituality permeates the community and how then to transmit these values and mission to others. Another brought this question around, how the emphasis on reconciliation then is translated into teaching and research and administration. It seems a kind of strange concept to many of us when we think about it in relationship to higher education. But when we look at the fragmentation of our times, the extreme polarization of society, the impact of ideologies that divide us and breed competition instead of collaboration, then all of a sudden, the sense of how do we bring unity and harmony without expending diversity and pluralism, this becomes an incredibly important occupation for Jesuit higher education. This attraction to a life oriented towards service, toward the help of others as a way of countering the culture which is narcissistic and materialistic and self-focused? How do we inspire without moralizing? How do we in fact activate the desire of people to serve the good rather than simply their own good? These are important questions for Jesuit education since the beginning, and all the more so now. Others raise the question around, how to practice the examen and what place should it have? What place does reflection really have within our work as educators, for ourselves and for others? And, of course, discernment is a big word, especially in our Ignatian tradition, but really, what does it mean? What are its implications for us when we're selecting curriculum, when we're crafting based on certain methodologies, how we want to teach and educate, what work we do in research and the method we choose, and certainly with regard to how we allocate resources in our educational institutions. So discernment, what is it, and what difference does it make in Ignatian leadership? We are a diverse group here of women and men, lay and Jesuit. To what extent are we talking about Jesuit, and to what extent are we talking about Ignatian? A broader category that may in fact transcend belief backgrounds and creeds. This particular webinar was branded, Ignatian leadership and its relevance to Jesuit higher education. But what is leadership? And what is distinct about this way of proceeding? And where do we really draw a kind of important distinction between individual leadership and that which is collective? And of course, in higher education, generally speaking, we're most interested in fostering a kind of collaborative approach to leadership, especially of our institutions, shared governance. And what role do methodologies like communal discernment play for fostering shared governance? These are many good questions. We won't be able to tackle all of them, but another polarity was raised, in terms of the survey, between how do we maintain excellence and continue to enhance the quality of our institutions, and at the same time, accessibility, affordability, openness, especially to the poor. This is a question of balancing polarities, not trying to problem solve them as if there's one option or the other. And this essentially is a question of discernment. The question of how to foster community. We live in a time when, because of our information overload and our capacity to use medias, we're often very isolated despite our ability to connect with one another. How does Jesuit education and how do our faculties and our staffs actually foster community rather than fostering isolation? And how do we lead people? We manage things, we lead people, but also how do we navigate the multiple roles we're in? So these are some of the questions that you were most interested in. Does this resonate with you from your inputs? Okay. These are the waypoints for our conversation then. Really, when I took from a document that we put together during the founding of the IAJU a few years ago, we had a very broad-based international team that really researched this question of what leadership is really required in Jesuit higher education today, both from Jesuits and lay colleagues. And this document, in many ways, compiles the best of our thinking at that time. And I'm going to present some of that data for you now. But really, what characteristics inform a leadership style that should be, in a sense, building on what is already considered good leadership, good management, and going beyond it? In particular, taking those professional standards that Carlos Losada was speaking of last week, and then adding spiritual maturity and social responsibility, these two characteristics. My own research is in the area of how adult maturation and spiritual maturation influence the way we take up our authority as leaders. Really, the implication between maturity and leadership is very, very close. So then the question of why does it matter for you, for your colleagues, for your students? You might notice already in our presentation the idea that there's a countercultural quality to so much of what Jesuit education is about. It stands for something. It stands for something more than market value or rankings. Not that these things are not important, but it positions itself related to a higher good, a greater good. And then really, as Susanna and I were commenting earlier, there's often a difference between the way we educate in a kind of a New World context of the Americas, where practical implications are so important, and the very rich continental tradition, which is more philosophical, theoretical. But in Jesuit education, we don't see this as a kind of false dichotomy. We see it as we do see it as a false dichotomy. We don't want to make it an either or proposition. We want to consider what are the implications of the things that we talk about here. So it's some open space. What characteristics would we say define a kind of Ignatian way of proceeding? I think it's very tricky to define Ignatian leadership. I've been working in this field for, about 18 years. And whenever I see definitions of Ignatian leadership, there's often some overlap between them. But what I like to say is that maybe there's an Ignatian way of proceeding, which opens things up without defining too narrowly. And here are some of the characteristics that I think are very important. One is that at the heart of discernment or Ignatian leadership is this practice of discernment, the ability to not just exercise prudential good judgment, but to bring transcendent values in. This question of what is the greater good? How do we, in a sense, help as a group, as an institution, as a team, as a classroom, enter into an experience of perception of reality, which is very qualitatively attentive to being, our experience, to what we know, and how these things translate into action in a way that is wise and good and just. So discernment is not simply good decision-making. It's a sort of way of thinking about our very existence and the way that we perceive reality, the way we sift through and understand what is good and what is better, and make choices along those lines. Service, from Ignatius's own foundations, he had this conversion experience which turned him inside out from self-focused, vain, and really materialistic, ambitious for his own good, to really turning all of that energy and attention outward to how he could be of service to others. We live at a time when often authority is understood as at the top of a pyramid. And this is exactly what Pope Francis is trying to overturn in the invitation to synodality, to flip that pyramid and see instead that at the bottom of the pyramid is the person who has the most formal authority, working with others to enhance the participation and the actualization of gifts and contribution of people at every level of the organization. Magis. Adolfo Nicolas, our previous general, wrote about the danger and the temptation, really, in an age of information, of superficiality, but instead pointed to the idea of magis, the sense of the more, a very Jesuit concept that comes back from Ignatius's own time, to the question of how do we deepen the quality of our work? How do we see underneath the surfaces of things? How do we analyze more profoundly the root causes of the challenges we face today? How do we understand more deeply the meaning and the value of the things that we are contemplating? So Jesuit education and Ignatian leadership are about depth, they're about quality. The idea that we, at a time when, in fact, many philosophers feel that there's an endangering of our subjectivity, our interiority, because of our focus outward, how do we, in fact, as leaders, slow down instead of speed up? How do we become more comfortable with silence? How do we understand how it's from that silence and from that depth that we want to act rather than reacting constantly to what's presented to us? As an administrator, a dean, we know that this is not so easy, that our lives become overwhelmed with demands from family, from the institution, from our students. So how do we draw better boundaries, and how do we reflect in a way that actually enhances the quality of our action in creative ways rather than reactive ways? And we want to acknowledge that, we as Jesuit educators are diverse. Some of us come from backgrounds that are not theistic. And at the same time, how do we make space for a spirituality and connection to life, which allows us to have conversation about things that are of ultimate importance to us, whether we are believers or not? How do we work in common cause in a way that sees the value and the facts together and overcomes that kind of fragmentation that we sometimes can get into theoretically and practically? So here's some qualities, but not an exhaustive list. When we think about the characteristics of an Ignatian educator, an Ignatian leader, I think it's important, whatever our background, to have an understanding of what the spiritual exercises of Ignatius really offer to us as a resource, to have at least a foundational knowledge of this spirituality, which means, beginning with an appreciation, whether we're, again, theistic or not, that finding God in all things is essentially a hermeneutic. It's a choice to see and interpret our life experience with a horizon that affirms diversity, the goodness of all things, and is at the same time open to transcendence, however we want to define that. An Ignatian spirituality is Christocentric. So again, independent of whether or not we might be Muslim or Jewish or Buddhist or Hindu, to notice the way in which this historical person and the beliefs that were developed around him, the theology around him, created a kind of pathway, just as the Buddha does, a pathway for purification and illumination and enlightenment, and for a deeper mystical union with what we think of as the divine, the Trinity. That this spirituality is oriented toward the liberation of the person from attachments, from ideology, from fears, and on a path of integration and development. Ignatius would talk about making progress in the Lord. How do we grow in this kind of Christoformic way? And ultimately, it's a spirituality that's oriented toward both loving service and co-creativity with God. So this is at the foundation, and we don't want to deny that. We live in a very secular society, many of us, but to deny these roots and foundations would really be to lose the kind of primary resource that we have in Jesuit higher education, one that is equally open to translation as it is to being able to stand on its own. A characteristic that many colleagues in this document had identified very early on was the importance of intellectual humility as educators, the sense in which we are called to see the world with wonder and curiosity, and to understand the partiality of our own disciplines, the partiality of our own ways of thinking and our own contributions. And out of that intellectual humility or modesty or sense of partiality, to be active in seeking connection and engagement with others, with a continual pursuit of learning. Another characteristic that our colleagues from around the world had identified for an Ignatian leader in Jesuit higher education is to very much have an intuition of the interconnectedness of things and of knowledge. So thus the sense in which we must be in constant conversation with different disciplines, with people even within our own disciplines who think in very different ways, and to be very aware of our tendencies to absolutize. And certainly we live in times when we see the threats of kind of absolute thinking. This leads to the importance of taking multiple perspectives. Last year, I had the privilege of visiting a little library in Palermo in Sicily, where in fact, it looked very much like this particular library pictured here. So many incredible nooks and crannies. And it's a reminder really of not only the smallness of each of us, but also the grandeur of this project of education and the value of seeing from different lenses. As Willie was sharing, how is our educational project, but also how is our own leadership open to transformation? How do we take perspective and chart our progress as leaders and managers and the way in which we exercise authority as a pathway of development, of growing in maturity, of learning to let go and make space for others? In fact, I would have to say in my own journey, and especially in my work with the Synod, this has been one of the most humbling aspects of the synodal process of the Church, is the invitation to see how our own leadership, how our own authority and contribution, no matter how excellent, if we take it up as a way of taking space or taking up our place in the front of the classroom or in front of a boardroom or a conversation circle, to the exclusion of others, we miss the opportunity to create space and facilitate something more creative, something more grand to happen. So Ignatian spirituality fosters an openness to ongoing transformation, an ongoing transformation of perspective and conversion of heart, and of growing of our capacities in our work, in our roles. We sometimes can, I think, use magis as a bit of a catchphrase, and sometimes it's so clearly misunderstood. I've so clearly misunderstood it as meaning doing more. But as many of us on this call understand already, that doing more is not always the best way of proceeding. That magis, as Ignatius experienced it, was not necessarily a call to do quantitatively more, but it was to have a deeper impact, which sometimes means saying no and allowing ourselves to discern what would be in the service of a greater yes. It may be that we've been putting off a certain research piece or publication because it's hard and it takes time to put our thoughts together. And we may be pulled in so many different directions, but in fact, in order to make a real advance, not only in our field, but to make a kind of magnifier impact, as Ignatius would have called it, we have to make choices. And the magis is about making choices for a greater good, for depth and for quality, and fostering a contagious desire to do the same for our students and colleagues. I think it's a kind of restlessness with mediocrity. It would be very easy for all of us to be going on to open AI these days and downloading our lessons plans and having it work through our documents. and sort of pulling out what we think we should be sharing with others. But that's never going to suffice for an Ignatian educator, nor for an educated student in our tradition. So how do we foster a sense of going beyond? We might be familiar with this term cura personalis, the care for the whole person, and find it very attractive. It has implications for the way that we work not only with our students, but also with our colleagues. It should influence the way that we actually run our human resources for our institutions. How do we see people not as chess pieces, but as individuals, as subjects, not objects? This, again, is especially important in a society which increasingly seems to dispose of people and see people as more instruments. But I believe that there's something, again, countercultural about this, which will never go out of style. It is sometimes seen as in tension with cura apostolica, another expression that comes out of Jesuit education, this care for the whole institution, the care for the mission and the work, as if individuals and the whole work are somehow at odds with each other. Often, I think that there's an innate tension between faculty and administration, because in many ways this polarity gets lodged in those two populations within our institutions. But in fact, we have to work together to hold and manage care of the person, attention to the individual considerations of what helps a person do their best work, live a full life, and the needs of the whole, the fairness, the equity, the concern about sustainability, the concern about, in a sense, how we maintain the financial health of our institutions. These things are not they're not reducible to each other. There's another care. I think that some of you are portrayed here actually in this particular photo recently taken. And we understand that in Jesuit educational institutions, whether we're on a faculty of theology or philosophy or in a large university setting, that if we don't have a sense of trusting, intimate, and caring community, that there's something that actually is missing, something really at the heart of Ignatian and Jesuit education, which is that we don't do this alone. We're part of a whole. We belong to each other. We belong to each other in a way that has responsibilities and involves active commitments. It's not easy to take time out for meaningful retreats. It's not easy to make time for table fellowship, but we know it's through these very simple means that we're not fed only in terms of our hearts and our social needs, but there's also an intellectual stimulation that happens when we gather with our colleagues. There is a way in which, as we build trust with one another across the boundaries of faculty and administration, for instance, we actually give capacity to make decisions that are deeper, more creative, and faster, more efficient, more effective. Caring for community is an end in itself, and it has so many benefits and consequences. It spills over not just within our own institutions, but to the importance of collaborating amongst our institutions, to not operating in silos. So an Ignatian leader, in my mind, is someone who's always thinking beyond the boundaries of one's own unit or institution, to be considering where might we actively collaborate and network for our larger mission, this mission of reconciliation and justice today. A mission which, coming from the United States, I feel is in such jeopardy in so many places, both in my country and many others. And that means not only thinking of ourselves as in service to those who are poor, but laboring directly with them and for them. Working together, for the things that mean most to us collectively. We know, for instance, that the refugee and migrant network of higher education just met here in Rome this past week, and it was very powerful to hear the testimonies of people whose lives have been affected by this collaboration amongst universities. This involves for us rigorous depth of analysis for us involved in this Jesuit University social project, as it's been called in recent years. Coming out of the experience of the universities in South America, where the Jesuit universities became extremely well known for bold and courageous defense of the poor, but also real analysis of the root causes of poverty and specifying where power is being abused. This is something that all of our universities actually need to do as part of this global mission. And we do so with a prophetic imagination that comes directly from our tradition. The Beatitudes, the spirit of Jesus's teaching on behalf of those who are poor, gives hope for a world to come. It's very easy, I think, to have an apocalyptic imagination these days for all the bad things that could go wrong in a world run amok with autocracy, polarization, the abuses of power, the climate issue, which we cannot help to really have to reckon with. And yet the prophetic imagination calls us to a positive vision, a hope-filled vision, which sees that by coming together, by overcoming our fragmentation, by serving as reconciling forces in society, by using our institutions as spaces to convene people, to come together, people who are different, people who need to be enlisted to work collaboratively to solve our common challenges, that a prophetic imagination is necessary for us to lead in an Ignatian way. There's enough reality checks of a dark nature that pull our attention, but can pull our attention to be distracted from all the good that we have ahead of us and the good that we have to do together. So essentially, those were characteristics that were derived from colleagues from around the world as really constitutive of an Ignatian way of proceeding. And where they really focused was this question of discernment as a basis for leadership. So beginning with the question of who are we, who is the discerning body that's coming together? Are we faculty of a certain discipline? Are we an institutional body? Getting clarity, what is our mission together? What is the superordinate purpose for which we are collected together? And how does that make a difference for how we see our particular roles and functions? Can we come to some consensus through conversation and reflection? What is the highest good that we're trying to serve? And what are the better options that we have in front of us? Whether we're looking to hire a new faculty member or launch a new program or close a program, what is for the better? And again, from an Ignatian approach, we would ask, what is God calling forth from us? From a more kind of translated and broader and inclusive approach, what future do we feel deep desire to co-create together for the greater good in the context of our institutions? And finally, how do we do so? There's a whole nother webinar probably in the works around the style of collaborative leadership and a communal style of discernment, which can foster depth of understanding and trust and consensus. These are features really that make shared governance possible and so necessary for us if we're going to continue to operate in the very fast changing and challenging context of higher education today. So discernment. I'm going to show you in a moment a kind of list of specific Ignatian leadership practices, and then we'll stop for conversation and for some question and answer. So these are various practical things that Jesuit educational leaders can be doing. Um, wherever we are, fostering a reflection, incorporating forms of the examen and reflexive practices that really explore what our goals are, our intentions, our purposes, how well we're fulfilling them, looking at places where we can make modifications and improvements, and really always looking to align with what we're doing so that there's a sense that the Jesuit educational mission has coherence, that even as a complex university is enacting so many different initiatives and directions of engagement, that it has coherence. The power of retreats, half-day retreats, full-day retreats, times to go away with faculty and staff together, as well as for particular faculties. As a dean of a business school that was just getting off the ground, it was so clear to me that unless we took time to get out of our classrooms and get out of our kind of individualistic mindsets, to see one another, to share table fellowship, to build community, and to reflect about what these superordinate purposes were we were serving, we were all just running in different directions. So the power of making time and space and allocating some resources for retreats, we as Jesuits do it for 8 days a year, if not in some cases more. And it makes a difference for the many different directions our attentions are often drawn, but it's so necessary. Mentorship and spiritual companionship. You know, within our Jesuit context, to have the richness of a faculty who have been around for a while, accompanying those who are new, and creating partnerships for mutual exchange is just a beautiful, beautiful way of exercising, I think, a kind of care in community. And also for those who want to deepen in this experience of the Ignatian spirituality and principles, to have opportunities for spiritual direction. These obviously are ways of aligning our spirituality and the mission, and not easy, of course, in many of our very secular contexts. And finally, I just want to propose that the Society of Jesus is really coming to rediscover the importance of our communal discernment methodologies, our ways of collaboratively making decisions about important things. But we're learning a lot, we're learning quickly. And the translation of these practices into the functions of university life, of institute life, are very clear to us. So this is definitely an area for future attention and development. Finally, I'm just going to close with this slide and then open up for conversation. You'll have access to this. There is a resource that we've developed at Discerning Leadership, which is a compilation of Ignatian leadership materials that you can use in your own institutions and translating them for your context. They're open source. So that's a website at the very bottom. Okay. So I'll stop there finally and open up the space for conversation, questions, feedback. What's on your mind? What's resonating with you? What are you confused by? What would you like to know more about? Maybe Gerhard wants to start us off. Oh, no.
David, yeah, maybe just one first question, so as a way to start. What about the fact of sharing or not sharing faith in the teams? How does things change? What are the limits and the possibilities? Can we quietly say we can do it to the full strength with or without faith, a common faith?
Great question. And I'm hopefully going to be brief here. I've done a lot of thinking about this. The fact that our Jesuit educational contexts are diverse and pluralistic is a reflection of the Catholic educational project. And the idea that we not only are multicultural and inclusive in a weak sense, but even go further and affirm and appreciate the diversity of people's backgrounds as people of faith or not. This has to be respected as a kind of deep first principle and expression, I think, of Jesuit education at its core. And it doesn't preclude the possibility that for those of us who are people of faith, we actually have the space to talk about in an open, non-exclusive way. If we fall into kind of a postmodern relativistic way of thinking, we say, we don't talk about faith because it's going to make people feel uncomfortable. But in fact, by not allowing us to talk about what's most important, we disallow that for everybody else. So my experience has been to really create hospitable spaces for engagement. It's important to create a kind of invitation for people to show up wherever they are, however they are, with authenticity. And for me, that meant in terms of formation programs for Jesuit higher education, to start with people's personal sense of calling. And to look for the intersection between a person's sense of calling and the mission of the institution, and that's where a synergy is found. So I may be, for instance, I'll think of a person who is on my faculty. This is a guy who is Harvard educated. He was raised by fundamentalist parents and left his faith behind a long time ago because he really found so much incongruence with his own authentic beliefs as a young person. And he adopted Kashmir Shaivism, which is a form of yogic esoteric practice. And he found such a powerful intersection between his practices and the Jesuit tradition. And he would constantly take me aside to say, I was just thinking about my practice today and how it kind of resonates with what you say is contemplation and action. Well, that's beautiful. If a person feels very, very inauthentic supporting the Catholic Jesuit mission of an institution because of its religious affiliation, because there's something so deep in oneself that is, dedicated to not, being Catholic or not being a theist, that's going to cause challenges for a person over the long term. And so, of course, we want to be welcoming in our institutions, but we also have to respect that they're not necessarily places where everyone will feel the same goodness of fit. I always felt like it was my role as an administrator to do everything I could to make hospitality felt and real and authentic, but I also couldn't take away that sometimes there was a conflict. Does that make sense?
Yes, yeah, it explains quite a lot to me. Thank you.
Yeah, and maybe others want to reflect on their experience around that tension of being, in a sense, religious in a secular and multicultural and really pluralistic world.
Well, my comment is quite near Gonzalo's, because I understand that faith is essential in our project. And but our reality in I was going to say in Spain, but in the Basque Country, at least in our area, is that perhaps I would dare to say most of the people don't believe in God. And our project is an inclusive one. It is clearly inclusive. So my comment was about the importance of the formation, because we all have to know about the project, and especially people perhaps that works from their own keys, from the solidarity, from vocation, professional rigor or something, or whatever it could be. We all have to know about the project and to be able to collaborate on it. That is my experience in my university. importance of the formation.
Yeah, yeah. I couldn't agree more, Marianne. You know, in interreligious dialogue, they say that the most challenging dialogue happens with people who don't know what they stand for. And so it's important for us, I think, to be very clear about what is the foundation for our institutions and our mission, and have something to offer people, but with it being a proposal, as you mentioned before, rather than a demand, and to, in a sense, help make faith attractive again. That's really a project, I think, that many of us in post-Christian contexts are faced with, how to do it in a way that has humility, as Pope Francis would say, understanding the excesses and the abuses, in fact, of the church. So it requires a huge amount of sophistication, if I'm not mistaken. Ignatius would say that when we meet the other, we should go in their door and meet them where they are, and at the same time have some idea of where we want to go in the conversation, with the willingness to be changed by the encounter. I think that's quite profound. So as educators, to realize that we have our various proposals from our disciplines, but as institutions, we want to make the proposal that the Christian faith remains, in our belief, true, good, a real contribution to society and to the world, and to at the same time understand that we are partners in a community of discourse that is much bigger and broader. That requires a huge amount of maturity, if I'm not mistaken. Yeah, yeah. Thank you for your comment. How about others? Questions, reflections?
I have a few minutes now of silence.
Okay.
Sorry for the cabaret sometimes behind, but yeah, that's the way it is. No, I was the video very much resonated within me because I participated in 2018 in that meeting, and that was really a transformative meeting and made me aware of this the precious gift of being within the Jesuit network, because everything you said is educating in these institutions is much more than just giving things away, but being part of a transformative process. But what I'm wondering is how can we keep on moving and transforming when the cultural background is so challenging? You mentioned that you need to be a mature personality. You need to be a mature personality, but maybe you can give some more hints how to achieve this personality, and to I don't know, a resilient way of life, facing all the challenges we are facing.
I saw it like that was lost.
It sounds like Gerhard has some wisdom for us.
The big challenge.
You know, I'm sure others have some thoughts about this, so I'd be curious what others have to say as well. My own instinct is to begin maybe where Ignatius would, and that is with gratitude and appreciation for what is already good. To begin with what we can celebrate about our cultures, about our traditions. It's very powerful, and I think it's almost an academic reflex for us to be critical and to look for what's missing and wrong. As an educated person, I think it's part of our habitus in many ways. But Ignatius had a different approach. He certainly could see those things, but he was, in a sense, inspired to begin with what was good and to notice where God was already at work from his hermeneutic. This allowed him to then see where he needed to focus and bring energy. The same, I think, is the case for us. You know, when we operate in a highly secular context, or a context which is even aggressively anti-Christian, because of the impact of the church and the shifting of sensibilities, what is it that we can connect with about this kind of new culture that's emerging, where there could be common ground. Where do we see that the kind of concerns and kind of alliances could be built? I think that's a starting place, but maybe others can say more. How do we navigate these contexts in which we operate? How do we portray the mission in a way that is authentic and at the same time acknowledges the countercultural quality of it?
Something I've noticed that makes difficult to put people in a mindset of mission is everything related to work relations. So when people think of them as workers, and so conditioned by all the legal issues and the difficulty of a laboral relationship, that somehow weighs too much. And for them, it's like seeing this as a mission for them would be like too idealistic, because the reality is hard and relations are hard. I don't know how can we say things, or how can we help to go beyond that?
So true, so true. I find that actually very often as administrators responsible for mission integration, we have to work very closely with human resource management in our institutions to make sure that the kind of context in which we're operating, the larger context, is the mission, in which we understand, yes, there's civil regulatory demands, there's legal issues, but they cannot be the driving kind of content that influences our decisions. They have to be a part of the equation, but not the whole equation. This requires a partnership with our HR administrators so that they have this kind of bigger understanding, because otherwise we'll be like every other secular institution, no doubt. And then we have no space to create a culture, right? So in a sense, mission integration requires not just structures, procedures, and processes, but it requires a culture. And to build a kind of intentional culture, a consensual, inclusive, intentional culture, requires a kind of shared work over time. No doubt, no doubt. Coming back to formation.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, for me, there's kind of tension in the mission that can discourage, and the mission, the individual and collective mission in an organization, which is the idea of coherence. Because if we declare certain values and take them as ideals, and we are here, and we just acknowledge that we are so far away from them, this doesn't feed the hope.
No.
But when we say, okay, we've got an idea, we are here, but we discern together, which means out of all the possible options that we have, we shall choose together, discern, so decide together which one is the one that makes us take the further step towards that idea. This raises the hope, instead of feeding the idea that, oh, we are not coherent, we shall never be totally coherent. This putting an ideal here and repeating that we are not up to this ideal is a source of despair, no? And instead, okay, here is our ideal, we are walking towards this ideal, and out of all the possible options, of the possible steps, this is the one that the matches, no, takes us together near that idea. No? I don't. So Pope Francis repeats that we need to accompany people to make possible steps. And possible is, he repeats it so many times.
Yes, yes, exactly. I think that this is so consistent, Pepe, with our educational methodology. We have experience, we acknowledge visions and goals, we move toward them, we don't make all the progress we need, we step back, we evaluate, we adapt, we do it again. You know, this kind of methodology, I think, is so consistent with what we say about our educational project, but we have to adopt it for ourselves in leadership in order to foster the cultures and kind of shift the institutions in the direction we want to go. I think one of the great challenges is the amount of turnover in institutions too, the loss of people who have that vision, that coherence, and want to contribute to the community. When we lose people, then we're starting over and over and over again. One of I think the things that's so important, again, from the perspective of building community, is building community where people want to be, where there's a sense in which the desire to contribute and commit is fostered because there's many things that reinforce my investment. Not a quid pro quo, but rather a sense that there's a mutuality between the institution and the members. So what else? What else comes to your mind, Susana?
Yeah, David, I always ask the Jesuit the question about, do you really believe that it is possible for a Jesuit university to apply communal discernment? I mean, we are talking about, in most of the cases, they are larger institutions, so many people, they are hierarchical. I mean, focus on discipline and now focus in ranking. So what would be the risk of doing that? And actually, do you know any real experience that any Jesuit university have tried to apply communal discernment I mean, not for making decision, because communal discernment is actually not for making decision, but for starting the process of thinking together in a synodal way?
In many different broad strokes. So, for instance, I know that there's growing attention to how boards can use this methodology around issues of approving strategic plans and things like that, or significant institutional investments. In the United States, for instance, there was one instance of a university using it as a way of determining which athletic conference it would participate in, because there were so many implications for the campus and for costs and things like that. So those are big communal discernments. And the operational question is often, is there a level of trust and inner freedom of the members to enter into the process? Or is there kind of like a fixed and pitched battle that's going to take place? Communal discernment requires that people have built trust with one another. So it requires a sense of community, a body that has some interdependence. It requires fostering clarity about the questions to be determined, but also what the options are, researching them. As you know, it's kind of a work of integrating what the head and the heart and the hands all need to do. And so that process is very much about getting the facts and research and clarity about the reality. I think it requires time, and often we don't have enough time to make these kinds of decisions. But my experience of working with groups is that when groups develop the practice of it, they can do it faster, because there's a deeper level of trust and people understand that a methodology is trustworthy. There's a process involved. There's a lot more to be said about this. And I think that you raise a great question. I think too often it's dropped in on people without the preparatory phases that are necessary. Those we just can't take for granted.
Yeah.
Can't take them for granted. What else? are you thinking about?
I mean, in fact, in our country, in Austria, during the last years, universities have become more enterprise-like, more hierarchical, more monocratic. Sometimes we are joking that universities are more and more resembling churches. So it's not always a joke, but somehow reflecting this hierarchical structure and so on. And I think that's not the outcome of a conscious decision against democracy and cooperation. We are forced to that direction because success is important, output is important. We have to produce publications and so on and so on. And I think that's really an obstacle to form a culture of community. And also the fact that not even at the moment, but we are going to a development where we do not have a long-living community. People are coming in and dropping out and so on. And what you said in your last statement, that you need to practice that over a longer time is hardly to realize. So I see really a tension between these goals, to have a good style of living, working together, and this performance orientation we are forced to realize.
No doubt, Willie, no doubt. This would be one of the polarities that we described. And unfortunately, it's not only the church that becomes a kind of metaphor for the way that hierarchy is formed in our institutions, but also corporations with really a total instrumentalization of all efforts toward bottom line goals. Unfortunately, this is quite a powerful and hard to defend against pressure. But I think in our institutions, we have to actually learn to navigate these apparent polarities between the ideals we have as educational institutions, especially of a Jesuit tradition, and these, in a sense, these market forces around bottom line goals. We can't operate one or the other. And in fact, this kind of black and white decision making is unfortunately pretty common, I think, in many administrative offices across our institutions, especially where we see demographics being affected, and we see then we get into a problem-solving mode, which is unfortunately not so creative, and very much suspends the values that we have. So I think that the vision that higher education administrators and Jesuit education have is got to be one of discerning these polarities, learning to hold them in a kind of both-and way that look at the benefits of each of these sides of the equation, for instance, and also are very aware of overuses on either end. If you're interested, we have on our website, Discerning Leadership, a video by someone who's extremely thoughtful about this question of how do we balance polarities in the way that we lead and manage. For instance, structure and flexibility, or other kinds of principles that we really need to hold value for as administrators and leaders. It's called Polarity Navigation, and it's probably about an hour or so long, but worth the time just to think about how to map what are often reduced to these either or kinds of propositions.
Thank you.
Yeah. How about others? So Alessandra, Anna, Lydia, Elena, Tomas.
If I could say, yeah, sorry.
Go ahead. You must go ahead.
So I'm thinking about, thinking about the mission, and thinking about the context of Sweden, for instance, which is like one of the most secular societies probably on earth. I think that, we tend to think about mission as some sort of activity or activism or active transforming work, but I tend to think that we're in a context where the work is rather like hermeneutical. It's about making sense and building explanatory bridges almost, and that way getting some sort of leverage by appealing to people's sense of confusion and trying to explain what we want. That's the most important thing, rather than doing something. I mean, it's more about listening and trying to find words. I'm not sure I'm making sense, but
listening and sense making. I think
Yeah.
that's a great way to maybe bring our time to a close. In fact, you know, we're trying to listen to the realities and the signs of the times, reflect on how our sense of the mission responds, and then sharing that as a proposal, and not as the answer, but as a compelling response that we invite people to engage with. And yeah, well, thank you for that, Tomas.
Maybe let's stop here, because we are it's about time to finish. So I think we've really gone through many of the questions. David, what is your impression maybe of the group and also the conversation and the questions on the table?
Well, if from my perspective, you're in touch with the real questions that that need to be considered. And it's really, for me, a privilege to kind of be in relationship to you today, hearing how people are continuing to take up this stewardship of this great mission, including future generations there. And so I'm very grateful to you all, and I'd encourage you to really keep the conversation going. You know, this opportunity that you've had together, it's just really the beginning in so many ways. And I hope that you'll continue as a cohort to be in conversation and dialogue and support for each other. It really matters to have colleagues who care about these things, to be able to bounce these things off. And yeah, so if there's ways I can be supportive, I look forward to that.
Thank you very much, David. Maybe let's all thank David for the webinar and the insights. I don't know if we can clap online, but
Thank you so much, David.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Yes, and we have your contact, David, so we might come back to you at some other point for some extra insights.
Yeah, please feel free to share the PowerPoint with people, including those resources that are on the last slide. They could be really helpful. I also do a weekly reflection on the connection between the Gospels and leadership. And if you find that helpful, it's available in English, Spanish, and Italian.
Where can we find that? I mean, it is
If you go to Discerning Leadership,
okay.
Yeah, it's there. And yeah, so happy to be with you. Thanks, everyone.
Okay.
Thank you so much.
Thank you
Thank
very
you,
much.
everybody. Take care.